And once again, we want to welcome you back. This is the Conservative Commandos radio show with Sharon Engel and yours truly, Rick Trader. And if you'd like to hear a rebroadcast of our show, watch a rebroadcast of our show, or maybe share it with a friend, which I hope you do, please check out our website, ccrshow.com. That's ccrshow.com. We have files there for our TV show there, our radio show. Also, check out our new Roku channel. Roku, if you have Roku, just do a search for American Uncensored News Network and you'll find our shows up on there. And with that, Sharon, we do have our next guest with us. He's not really a guest, but he is. And I'll let you explain that one.
Well, I think he's a great guest. He's also a conservative commando, and so I know what you mean. He's a longtime friend of the show. George Landrith, President and CEO of Frontiers of Freedom, public policy think tank devoted to promoting a strong national defense, free markets, individual liberty, and constitutionally limited government. In 1994 and 96, George was a Republican candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from the Virginia's 5th Congressional District. His work has been printed across the nation, including the Washington Times, Chicago Tribune, LA Daily Times, National Review, Sacramento Bee, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Providence Journal, Daily Caller, Washington Examiner, Town Hall, and Human Events. George is also a co-host, as I said, here on the Conservative Commandos radio show. George, welcome back to the Conservative Commandos radio show.
Feels like home.
I hope so. You know, you write some great articles, and one of them that you've written is Caucasus Power Vacuum at Stake. First, let's do a little geography lesson. Where are the Caucasus and who cares?
Well, yeah, so we're talking about the not the state of Georgia, but the nation of Georgia, a former Soviet republic, part of the former Soviet Union. Of course, they broke off, because thankfully we won the Cold War. And they have been migrating, as it were, towards the West. But, and they'd like to become a member of NATO and so forth. I think they understand that they're at risk with one of their neighbors being Russia, and with Putin wanting to kind of rebuild, if he could, the former Soviet empire. So economically, they're kind of looking to the West as well. And that's not really that unusual. A lot of the former Soviet republics have this very kind of difficult relationship with Russia. And what I mean by difficult is Russia, of course, had large numbers of troops and citizens there. So they actually have a lot of, what you might call ethnic Russians in their country, and people that have a certain affinity for Russia. At the same time, I think they recognize that their freedom is probably not best suited by becoming co-opted again by Russia as a power. And so they don't necessarily want war with Russia, but I think they want to have friends beyond Russia and make sure they're part of a broader, Western, country, civilization. So, but what you do see happening is China and to some degree Russia, both undermining that, somewhat for different reasons. Russia does it because they feel like they want to keep these countries close to them and dependent upon them. And so they'll use their natural gas and their oil reserves as a way as a leverage point to tighten down on people. We've seen them, for example, cut off gas to countries at strategic times in the middle of the winter time, just to kind of like remind them who's in charge and stuff like that. China doesn't do it to help Russia because they obviously have their own self-interest. They do it to weaken America or to weaken the West. And they want very much. So their goal, and what we have now going on in the Caucasus is, in the state of, or the country of Georgia, is the Chinese would like to provide as much infrastructure as possible, again, because then they can turn it off like Putin does. And so they have information superhighway that was scheduled to be put in place with foreign investment from the West. And China is trying to muscle that out and have it be them that builds this, information superhighway that would go through their country and provide their country with, modern, not just telecom, but, information services and so forth. So I think it's a very interesting problem. And I think for most Americans, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, it's half around the world. Who cares? And I would argue, we better pay attention because China is trying to put a chokehold on the entire world, and their goal is to isolate everyone else, particularly the U.S. But because they understand we're the ones they have to. If they want to be the top dog, they're going to have to, essentially dethrone us as the world's strongest nation, both militarily and economically. And they've been working on it for 30 years or longer, and we haven't been paying attention. Unfortunately, the president is now paying attention, and that's important. But we're not in a position any longer to pretend it's not happening. And so the point of my article is to kind of say, hey, wake up. Look at what China's doing here. They're doing it in shipping. They've got, and fortunately, Donald Trump got rid of or made them divest their ownership interest in one of America's largest ports, I think the largest one on the West Coast in Long Beach, California. They owned it. The Chinese did. And he said, not going to happen. And so he used the federal government's power to require them to divest themselves of it. So they had to sell their interest in it to an American company. We have to be, I think, more proactive as a nation. And thankfully, we have a president who gets that. But I'm worried that Congress isn't paying attention. They've got other priorities, and it would be bad news.
Well, so that leads me to this power vacuum. We know where the Caucasus are now. What's the power vacuum? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So what I guess I alluded to it, but I didn't really explain it fully. So bottom line is the Georgian government had an arrangement in place to have a, almost $3 billion deep water seaport, built on their Black Sea. And that's, it's important for trade, and Russia wants to control that. So they're getting involved in that. And I would argue when you look around at what's going on, a lot of pressure is being brought to bear on Georgia, twisting of arms, so to speak, with that deal and other deals. Just the whole question, like China would want very much to have greater pathways for investment, and they'd like to be the ones that build things, because then they can turn it off and turn it on, and so forth. But so I think we have to essentially up our game and do more to make it clear we're an ally, we're a friend, we're a reliable trading partner, and economically, you'd really rather hitch your wagon to us than to them. And I think it may be necessary for Trump to remind if Georgia's having its arm twisted by Russia or China, he may have to step in and perhaps do some of his own arm twisting, but he might also have to kind of put some pressure on China and Russia to not twist arms as much. And I think, because the problem with it is if everyone's twisting arms, the guy's arms just get broken off, and then you have basically a country with in the metaphor, who's just injured. And it seems to me that that's not where we want to go with this.
Now, the Black Sea is a seaport, and Russia doesn't have too many of those that are year-round seaports.
Right.
The Black Sea really offers that to them. So I can see them getting real aggressive with Georgia. Is that a possibility? I mean, wanting to take over that port.
Yeah, we've seen that with Ukraine. They've been pretty aggressive with Ukraine. So I think it would be safe to assume that Russia will start off with arm twisting, and that it will escalate from there. It's hard to predict the future, but I think you're right. I mean, part of the Russian expansion historically, even during the Tsars, was this need to have a full year-round, warm water port, as opposed to being kind of a landlocked nation. And not that they're truly landlocked, but but semi-landlocked, because some of the waters, wintertime really aren't that useful. And so they, but I think we have to understand that there are economic issues being driven here, but so is this kind of goal of expansionism. And when they expand, freedom recedes. When they expand, whether it's China or Russia, I would argue that American interests are in the what do you call it? Kind of in the wane. So bottom line is, I think we ought not say to ourselves, these countries are halfway around the world. What difference does it make? I think, we want to continue to see Georgia as a nation liberalize and become more westernized. And one of the great problems that all these countries have, to be honest, is the legacy that they have is one of corruption and autocracy. And so you see, like in the Ukraine, lots of corruption. Why? Because that's how the Soviets did things. I mean, that's how all totalitarians work. If you're willing to kill people, you'll also cheat people. That's so these are nations that killed millions of people, but they'll also basically operate by corruption. That's
even American totalitarians. We're watching that one firsthand, aren't we?
Yeah.
We are coming to you from the Conservative Commandos Radio Network studios and around the world on the internet with TalkStream Live, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Net Talk America, and AM/FM 24/7. I'm Sharon Engel here with my co-host Rick Trader, and we're talking to another co-host, but also an author, great writer, George Landrith, President and CEO of Frontiers of Freedom. We've been talking about the Caucasus and the power vacuum there. We're kind of speculative about that, but we'll continue this conversation after our break.
And once again, we want to welcome you back. This is the Conservative Commandos radio show with Sharon Engel and yours truly, Rick Trader. And for a rebroadcast of our show, check out our website, ccrshow.com. That's ccrshow.com. Be sure to like us, friend us, and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. George Landrith is our co-host, or our guest. He's also our co-host here on the Conservative Commandos. In addition, George is the president and CEO of Frontiers of Freedom, and we're discussing an article that George has written, A Caucasus Power Vacuum at Stake. George, thank you for holding through that break. We appreciate your time. George, you and Sharon were talking about the arm twisting of Georgia by Russia. It's a little bit more than arm twisting, George. Haven't they actually sent their armies into Georgia in the past?
Yeah, well, there's a history of that, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, obviously, if somebody has, broken in your home and committed violence against you and your family, if they start telling you that you'd better behave differently or you could have trouble, that means something a lot differently than somebody just saying, asking you what's up and, and asking what maybe you intend to be doing in the future or something. So the implied threat is pretty strong because there's a history here. These folks for a couple generations were under the thumb of Soviet dictators.
George, in your article, you write the U.S. support for Georgia's membership membership of NATO and the ascension of the European nations remains strong and often touted. There's a renewed support for a free trade agreement between the United States and Georgia. But you also write in here, recent moves by the Georgian government to undermine the U.S.-European-backed investment consortium contracted to construct that seaport.
Right.
You also have in here the Georgia National Communication Commission used its power to, as you say here, to undermine a business deal between the internet company and NEQSOL Holdings. With these actions, George, why do we want to reward them with membership into NATO? Why would we want to reward them with most favored nation status?
Well, I think that what we probably want to do at this point is try to get Georgia back on track, because what's happened is basically Georgia's probably was walking down the street, and they just got mugged by China and Russia, and they're trying to escape that mugging and have it not become a killing by saying, okay, we'll agree. So my point would be is when you understand that's what happened, we ought to go in and try to help them be secure and make sure that mugging, because people will do whatever they've got to do to avoid, when you've got a razor blade up against your throat in a dark alley, you'll agree to lots of things that you might not have
George,
agreed to.
there's the carrot, but where's the stick?
Well, I think obviously everything in foreign policy has to have the carrot and the stick. So I think we probably do have to make it clear that if you guys want to look to the West and be part of the West, then you got to really toe the line. And we will try to help make it so that you're not getting mugged in the alley. But at the same time, if we're protecting you from being mugged in the alley, we will expect you to, be our friend and not theirs.
George, I want to move on to another article that you have written. Use the Defense Production Act to encourage American manufacturing and security. And you write here, America has for decades been chasing its manufacturing base out of the country. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, now for at least a couple generations, we have had as a national policy to chase certain businesses out. In fact, I've heard members of Congress talk about, well, we don't need those jobs. And that's kind of easy to say when you're a member of the Senate because there's only 100 of you. And, your job for the next 6 years is secure. But, so you can sit there and say, oh, yeah, But if you're one of the people whose job that was, and the guy says it's okay to chase it out of the country, you're like, what? Wait, that's my job. What are you talking about? And so, but we kind of told ourselves as a nation that, oh, it's okay, it's going to work out. As China becomes more industrialized and more like us, they'll behave more like us. Well, guess what? That's not true. China's not becoming more like us. They're every bit as repressive, as cruel, as dictatorial, and as dangerous as they ever were. In fact, they're much more dangerous than they used to be. And so I think we have to stop chasing our business overseas. And we've now seen, and I learned something here, which was I used to kind of say to myself, obviously, I'm not excited about, I wouldn't want to buy my aircraft carriers or my planes or my bombers or my missile defense from the Chinese, the Russians. But I now have a few more things I'm not sure I want to be buying from them. And that might be, for example, medical supplies, the things we need to make medicine. We've seen
this during this last alleged pandemic where China has even threatened to block sending us the medicine. By the way, 90% of our medicine is manufactured in China right now. That's scary.
I'm not sure if it's quite 90%, but it's a pretty high. It's certainly more than I'm comfortable with. But you're right. There are a lot of this is made there. Some of it's in India, and India's of course less problematic because they're not our enemy. But my point is, even an ally in a time of strife. I mean, for example, pick our ally you feel that would be the most friendly to us. I don't know if it's Canada or Great Britain or Israel, but whatever that nation is in your mind, ask yourself this question. If they are also experiencing a pandemic and they need these supplies, are they going to ship them to you? So they don't have to be your enemy. They can be your friend. It's still, but when they're your enemy, as we saw with China, they clearly were being strategic in that. So my point is we ought to undo the past where we've used tax policy, we've used our regulatory policy to effectively chase them away. And I think the analogy I've used is, if I invited you over for dinner to my house and then you arrive, and as soon as you arrive, I start hurling insults at you, and then I grab a baseball bat and chase you around the house until you run out the front door and go, what happened with that kook? And, then it makes no sense for me to sit around going, why did Rick not stay for dinner? What a rude guest. I invited him for dinner. I made dinner and he didn't even stay for dinner. You're like, George, you've lost your mind. You were chasing with a baseball bat. So my point is we've done that effectively with our industrial policy to many of our businesses. Why? That was a dumb policy. So we ought to create some tax incentives. We ought to create some other incentives to bring that business back. And I would argue that we've done that with the Eastman Kodak, and I think it's a good thing. We often think of them as a film company, but they're actually a chemical company to make some of the medical chemicals that are required. They don't make medicines, they might make the precursors that are used and bring some of that business home. And, George, and then they can compete.
You talk about ask this question. Well, I think the American people need to ask this question. Considering both these issues that we're talking about, can you imagine how emboldened China would be with a friend like Joe Biden and all his ties in the White House, all Joe Biden's ties to China? I mean, Joe Biden wants to raise income taxes, all right, to the levels that they were at when these companies left America for greener pastures. Donald Trump has lowered the taxes to entice these companies to come back. Now, again,
he's also reduced the regulatory burden, which is a very, very important step. It's harder to put a price tag on it because it's not a tax. It's kind of gives you an obvious price tag, but the regulatory burden is very significant. It's probably at least as important as the tax rate.
All right, George Landrith.
And what do you think he's going to do? Is Biden going to reduce regulations or increase them?
No, he's already said he would increase the
with
regulations.
The Green New Deal and stuff
increase
like that?
taxes. Yeah, I mean.
And regulations.
We might as well just put a sign outside that says we're closed.
Yeah.
Go somewhere else.
Get out of here. He's going to pick up the baseball bat and chase him back out.
Indeed. George Landrith, President and CEO of Frontiers of Freedom, co-host here on Conservative Commandos. George, you write a lot of great articles. Tell our audience where they could go to read them, because we're kind of like a Whitman sampler here. We'd like to give people a little bit of taste, but where could they go to get a whole mouthful of George Landrith?
Well, all my stuff you can really find pretty easily at ff.org because it's published in many different places. So if I told you all the places to go, you wouldn't necessarily. But so if you go to ff.org, you'll find it there. You can certainly Google my name, George Landrith, and I also tweet most of my articles out if I remember to do that, and that would be G Landrith. That's GLANDRITH, and those are really probably the best two ways.
Well, George Landrith, it's great to see you. I have a feeling I'll see you a little later on in this week, which is always a treat for me. But again, George, thank you so much for joining us. Take care and God bless. And you are listening to and watching the Conservative Commandos radio show. We share an angle, and yours truly, Rick Trader. On the other side, we're going to be joined by radio talk show host Gary